the debrief itself, it's more than just asking questions. So at its core, the most fundamental, you have to have the right questions. But the other piece to a debrief is sometimes it requires a little bit more structure than let's have a conversation. So let me share a few ways that you're going to be able to structure your debrief, or you might think about structuring again based on the learning outcomes and the intent of your training session. So the first one that I'm going to talk about is simply what this is, right? So debriefing structure, this is a pretty simple one, just a verbal Q&A. So let's pick out some questions from this handout or some questions that we use, and let's have a conversation. And it could be in a small group and then a large group. The thing about this is anytime we have questions, especially debrief questions, we do need to give people time to process what they just experienced. So either give the debriefing questions out and let people think about it, or maybe you even give the debriefing questions out in advance of an activity to have people thinking about what they should be learning or thinking about, and then come back to those questions after the activity's over. Another way to give structure is just individual journaling. Now, this particular strategy has some pros and cons. So, when it comes to pros, it challenges everyone in the learning experience to think about what they just did. Now, the con to this is that if you don't have report outs, then people may miss out on key takeaways or thoughts that some other people in the room had. So there's definitely some advantages and disadvantages to doing something that's individual, but it does challenge everybody to come up with their own key takeaways. Another kind of debriefing structure. Sometimes I'll use this structure after a teach back during a train the trainer session or after a role play or something like that, is pluses and deltas. And so this is simply it kind of the traditional pluses and deltas is simply to have a T chart that just says, okay, what went well and what would we change for next time? Now, there's some ways to go beyond that or to give that a little bit more intent and structure. So if you wanted to have some alternate questions to the pluses, it could be, things such as what did you do that you would want to make a habit? Or what decision did you make in the moment that you'd want to make again and why, right? So those are kind of pluses, but it gives us a little bit more direction. It gives the learners a little bit more direction to this because sometimes when we ask a general question like what worked well, we can get all sorts of answers, but these questions kind of help to steer the conversation. And also, when it comes to the deltas, it's not just what would you change, but maybe when during that did something feel off, or what else would you need to be more successful, right? So those questions might help to give a little bit more structure to the pluses and deltas. Those are all simple ways to structure. Let me give you two more ways to structure your debrief session. And the one of them is an after action review. This is so the original concept of this comes from the U.S. military after they do some sort of training exercise. But I've seen it used also after a simulation, sometimes after a role play, things like that, in a training room as well. And so the after action review basically asks several questions. One is what was supposed to happen? So what was the plan going into that learning experience or that simulation? And then what actually happened? So what was the reality? Why was there a difference? And what will we do differently next time? So that gives us a little bit of structure in terms of how we're going to talk about the experience that we just had. And one final way, and there's lots of different ways to structure debriefing, but I wanted to kind of just give you a few samples of things that can go from simple to intermediate to complex. And the most complex one is represented by the acronym ORID, and this is developed by the Institute of Cultural Affairs. And the purpose of this, and this needs some practice. Probably there's whole trainings that you can go to that help people kind of navigate this particular process in order to facilitate it effectively. But basically, what this does is it slows down the feedback and has people break down their thoughts of the debrief into different components. So the first thing that we might do is focus on the O, which is objective observations. And so what facts did you see or hear or read? Or the next step is, okay, so after the facts, right? So after the objective observations, let's get a little reflective now. What's your gut reaction? How did it feel? Was there some tension someplace in here? What was happening? So that's kind of more of the subjective observations, and then we figure out, okay, well, how do we interpret this? So what was the meaning of the outcome to that experience that we just had? What was the key takeaway? Why did this happen? And then finally, the D is the decisional. What's the next step or action plan? Now, there's lots of different structures. The simple stuff can be done just using some questions. The more complex strategies and structures need some practice, maybe even some training in how you actually do that. But that all leads us back to the question of how should we debrief? I asked this question at the very beginning of this webinar. We've talked about some different buckets for the training intent. We've talked about questions that go beyond surface level questions. We've talked about some different ways to structure your debriefing. So when might we use each of these different structures? And I know that we're running a little short on time here, and we have some wrap up announcements that we want to make. But I'm just going to real quick walk you through the very bottom of that handout that has all of the questions. I guess it's the very last page of that handout has all the questions. Also has a table that looks like this. And I was gonna just kind of do a quick polling activity to end here, but I'm not gonna do that. We're just going to, this will be something that as you think about the different strategies and the different intents for training, there's some different ways to do it, but there's also some things that might not be so appropriate. And so if I was doing a training that was just focused on general awareness, the only strategies that I might use would be either verbal Q&A or individual journaling. I'm going to leave you all to kind of thinking through, if I do a technical training or if I do leadership development or if I do a training on safety, quality, and compliance, or, kind of insert your own training intent in here. What would be some of the strategies I might want to use? What would be a little bit too much? And what's not enough, right? So which strategies might we want to use? The